Welcome to day 3 of the 12 days of Celtic mythology. We're taking a leisurely stroll through a wonderful Welsh tale called Culhwch and Olwen. If you missed the previous days, they should be easy to find by going to my channel page. I want to take a few minutes at the beginning today to respond to some of the comments people have been leaving and also ideas that people have raised in the live class. If you're enjoying this series, why not take one of my online classes? There's almost always something on offer. Some classes have tiered pay what you can pricing, and there are usually a few scholarships available for the more expensive classes. To get notifications about classes and about scholarships when they're announced, you can go to my website and subscribe to my newsletter or follow me on my Patreon page. Quite a few people have read Culhwch and Olwen, they tell me, and I'd say that at least half said that they did find it hard to understand. I'm not at all surprised. You have my sympathy. Some people have only read a synopsis. It's a good start. And a few people mentioned Peter Beresford Ellis's retelling of it. Now, I haven't read that. I'm not a fan of Ellis, not because of what he leaves out, but because of what he sometimes adds. And that's probably my biggest issue with retellings or fiction based on mythology, is when people add in new things, and then the reader doesn't know that those things are not part of the original tale. So I shared a link to a recording of Robin Williamson telling the story, and quite a few people liked that. Of course, he has to leave a few things out, but otherwise, Williamson is very faithful to the text, and I really enjoy the way he tells the story. A lot of people mentioned their difficulty with written Welsh names. Yeah, the good news is that it gets easier if you stick at it. Welsh is one of the most consistent languages as far as letters always having the same sounds, like how English is really inconsistent with that. Welsh is extremely consistent. So once you learn the system, it's easy to pronounce written Welsh, even if you don't speak Welsh. Now, Christopher Hughes has made a very good video on Welsh pronunciation. We're not related, by the way. And I'll put some other links in today's resources. Yesterday, I asked what people thought of Arthur and Culhwch as far as what their characters or personalities are. One of my students in the class talked about how Arthur's maturity and the security of his position makes him kind of unflappable. He's not going to bother getting into a squabble with some young upstart who's just mouthing off. And I think that's a really valid observation. A lot of people said the same thing in the comments. One person there compared Arthur to Bendigeidfran from the second branch of the Mabinogi, since both are kings bound by rules of hospitality. That's also a really good point. I've got another wee snippet concerning Arthur and Bendigeidfran later on today. Most people put Culhwch's rudeness down to some version of being a bit of an entitled toff, a spoiled brat. I think that's the most obvious reading of the situation. When I was telling the story yesterday and trying to sort of get into the characters of Arthur and Culhwch as they spoke to one another, I had another little insight. Sometimes that happens when you do that. And one or two people kind of mentioned this in the comments too. Remember that Culhwch's stepmother has sworn this destiny on him. Olwen is his only chance of finding love, marrying, or getting an heir. And we heard the first day about how after she did that, he went around blushing, which I think might be a bit of a euphemism, if you see what I mean. He's struggling to control his feelings as young men do. So he feels a tremendous urgency, even desperation, to locate Olwen and win her. It feels like life or death to him. So that also maybe accounts for his rash behavior. And finally, I want to give a wee shout out to the person who keeps mentioning Mabon ap Modron and Maponos and the tablet of Chamelier. That's actually a really big interest of mine. And if you don't know, I've made loads of videos about those topics. I'll put a link to the playlist in the comments. And we'll be talking much more about Mabon, at least later in the series. So please keep your comments coming. I really would love to give some free classes away to people who are interested. So I'm not trying to catch you out on technicalities or anything like that in the challenge. Keep sharing those answers and don't forget to check out what other people are writing. So on we go with today's plan. Did you remember to bring your exploring gear? I don't know, maybe we should all wear Indiana Jones hats. So far, we've followed our hero Culhwch to the court of King Arthur, who's his cousin. Arthur has promised to help him win the hand of Olwen, the woman he loves. And now the story grinds to a halt as Culhwch invokes his request in the name of Arthur's warriors, hundreds and hundreds of them by name. So this is the part of the story where many people give up and others quite understandably skip forward. But there's treasure in this wall of text. This long passage is usually known as the court list, and we're going exploring through its dark and musty corridors to see what we can find. If you're reading this story from Will Parker's website, which I've linked to, you'll notice that almost every name on this list has a footnote. Most of the names actually do mean something, often appearing elsewhere in Welsh literature and mythology. I've divided the court list into 3 and put it into like a list form to make it easier for me to work with. Now, there are 122 names, if I counted correctly, just in today's section. So this is how that looks. I know it's too small to read. I just wanted to give you a sense of it. The colors are just me marking out some of the groups of names, such as brothers or fathers and sons in some of these little blue groups. And the blocks of text toward the end are where a bit of a story is included for a character. There are a few of those thrown in. So there are some well-known characters in today's section. It starts with the ever-present Kai and Bedwyr and Gwythyr, whom we met yesterday as one of Culhwch's companions in the story. And we'll be hearing about Graid, son of Eri, in the coming days, and Graidol. We'll look at some of the other more famous names, but I also want to look at some obscure ones for a moment, just to give you an idea of what's going on here. So not far down the list, we meet these chaps. If some of that looks like pretty dubious Welsh to you, you'd be right. These names are all borrowed from Irish tradition. Have you spotted anyone you know? So the first one is an Irish king. And once we unscramble their names, Cnichur, son of Ness, Kibert, son of Daira, we can see that these other 5 are central characters from the Ulster cycle. What are they doing in Culhwch and Olwen? Who knows? As I've said before, the author is a hoarder. Scholars think that maybe these names must have been part of a list that was copied and recopied by scribes, ultimately scribes who didn't know any Irish. There are some simple copying errors mixed in with an attempt to make sense of the names as Welsh names. So none of these men fought under Arthur, and by the time the story reaches us, it's not certain whether they're even seen as Irish anymore by the storyteller or just exotic names being perpetuated one last time, but here they are. Culhwch and Olwen is littered with references to Ireland in the story itself, many of which are understood as Irish to the storyteller and the medieval listener. Many of these names maybe were once understood too, or maybe they were just lifted from an old text somewhere and added to make this list longer and more interesting. I felt like doing one more random pick, and this really was completely random. So here's our friend Gluluith, the gatekeeper, sandwiched in between 2 names which are entirely obscure to me. So Dristwern could be a sort of Brythonic version of the name Tristan, Tristan actually being an anglicized name of Dristan. He's probably not the Tristan from Tristan and Isolde. It's just a similar name. For example, there was a Pictish king called Drosten, which becomes Dristan in Welsh. Another possibility is that it was originally Drist Turin Hiren, or something like that, meaning Drist Iron Fist. Now the other guy, Hloch Llau Hwyniog, means flock of the striking hand. He turns up in Who is the Doorkeeper, the poem about Arthur and Glewlwyd that we looked at on day one. Remember, that poem is also all about listing Arthur's mystical warband. So it's not surprising that a lot of people from that poem will also be in our court list. In Who is the Doorkeeper, he's called by a variant name, you can see here. That might mean windy or stormy hand. He could just maybe be a sort of avatar of Lugh or Llay, who also have epithets of long hand or skillful hand. But quite a few Welsh figures are hand this or hand that, so I wouldn't get too excited about that part. Later in the court list, he turns up again as Llywch Llawwyniog. Sorry, I mispronounced that. Wyniog, father of 4 men called Gwair, who are Arthur's uncles. So by now you might have noticed something. These 3 all have something to do with hands. And that's probably why they're listed together. So none of this is as random as you think. I didn't notice the hand thing until I started translating the names. So you can see how these names are part of a really complex network of lore. There are several good reference sources for looking everything up, which is how I'm pulling this together for you. They will be in the list of references for today on YouTube. But if you've already got the link for Will Parker, and he tends to summarize other people's findings in his footnotes, so it's kind of all there. This thing of having 3s reflects a tradition of triads in Welsh lore. Triads are collections of 3 similar events or people, often accompanied by a short synopsis of their stories. These seem to have been developed as memory aids for the bards and storytellers who had so much to keep track of. Many of these triads have been preserved in early manuscripts, and sometimes they give us a glimpse of alternative versions of stories from the Mabinogi, or snippets of information about characters, or stories that don't exist as full stories anymore. One of the most useful books for students of Welsh lore, after a good translation of the Mabinogion, is Trioedd Ynys Prydein by Rachel Bromwich. I go into more detail about this book in my video about the best Celtic mythology books. There's quite a bit of shared material between the triads, which were preserved, and the text of Culhwch and Olwen. So for example, if we look at Triad 52, here's Mabon ap Modron mentioned as a prisoner, which he is in our story. 3 exalted prisoners of the island of Britain. Slir, half-speech, who was imprisoned by Eroswydd, and the second, Mabon, son of Modron, and the third, Gwair, son of Gwairioedd. And one was more exalted than the 3 of them. He was 3 nights in the prison of Caer Oeth and Anoeth, and 3 nights imprisoned by Gwen Pendragon, and 3 nights in an enchanted prison under the rock of Ecaifiaint. This exalted prisoner was Arthur, and the same lad released him from each of these 3 prisons, Gorai, son of Custennin, his cousin. So Arthur's first imprisonment here is in Caer Oeth and Anoeth. You might remember that Glewlwyd mentions this in his overblown speech to Arthur yesterday. Then, toward the end here, it mentions Gorai, son of Custennin. Arthur's cousin Gorai is also Culhwch's cousin, of course, and he's a fairly major player in our story later on. There are often variant forms of triads that turn up in stories that aren't actually in the official triads that survived. So we find Mabon in his prison in a scene in Kilhach and Olwen, and he says this: Mabon, son of Modron, it is, imprisoned here, and never has anyone been imprisoned in an imprisonment as mournful as mine, neither the imprisonment of Llyd Llaw Eraint, nor the imprisonment of Graid, son of Eri. This seems to be a similar triad about prisoners, but the only one in common with Triad 52 is Mabon. We also get seemingly unique triads happening right in the court list. And this is three men who survived the Battle of Camlan, supposedly Arthur's final battle, I believe. Morvran, I'll Tegid. No man laid a weapon on him at Camlan because of his ugliness. Everyone thought he was a demon fighting alongside them. The hair on him was like the hair of a stag. Now you might recognize Morvran. He's the son of Ceridwen. He's sometimes also known as Avagddi. And Santhe Prydein, no man laid a spear upon him at Camlan. Because of his beauty, everyone thought he was an angel fighting alongside them. And Saint Kinwyl, one of the three men who escaped from Camlan. He was the last to be parted from Arthur on Hengrain, his horse. So we started off talking about Arthur today and how the Welsh perceived him. I don't think there's a single answer to that. But while we're on the triads, I thought I'd throw this into the pot. You might know that at the end of the second branch of the Mabinogi, after Bran is killed, his friends bury his head at Tower Hill in London, where he's supposed to protect the island of Britain from invaders. Well, what about this? This is quite a long triad, so this is the first of the three things in the triad here. Three fortunate concealments of the island of Britain. The head of Ben de Gaedfran, son of Llŷr, which was concealed in the White Hill in London, with its face toward France. And as long as it was in the position in which it was put there, no Saxon oppression would ever come to this island. So it goes on to list two more things that are concealed. And then it has a second part, which are the three unfortunate disclosures. In other words, three things that were revealed. And they were the three unfortunate disclosures when they were disclosed. And it's the same three things. And so the first one, Arthur disclosed the head of Ben de Gaedfran, Bran the Blessed, from the White Hill. So that's Tower Hill in London, because it did not seem right to him that this island should be defended by the strength of anyone but by his own. So Arthur dug up Ben de Gaedfran's head, according to tradition, because he thought only he should protect the island of Britain, and it shouldn't be protected by this magic. So it seems that there was at least some tradition, maybe of questioning Arthur's judgment, and perhaps maybe seeing him as a bit arrogant too, to do that. On the other hand, other people might see it as a Christian Arthur digging up something pagan, Bran said, who knows? And there's another trio of names that you might have noticed. These three Gwyns, one of whom is Gwyn ap Nudd. I know people are interested in him in particular. Somehow I've never made a video about Gwyn ap Nudd. So tomorrow I'm going to spend some time exploring his lore, both in Culhwch and Olwen and in other Welsh texts. And we'll have a little look at the middle part of the court list, of course. So now today's question. I've talked a lot about how the storyteller or author of Culhwch and Olwen seems to be trying to gather up all the lore he can find and put it into his story. The theory that I favor is that his motivation for doing this is preservation. But there are other ways of looking at this. So I'm wondering, do you agree with me? Or can you see a different reason why this story is like this? What's the deal with all these lists and obscure references to other things? I'd love to know what you think, whether you agree with me or not. And I'll be back tomorrow with lots of stuff about Gwyn ap Nudd. Bye bye.